for good afternoon, good evening, and all the participants of Digital Futures. So this is an event of PhD Doctoral Consortium of Tongji University. And we have around 15 to 20 PhD candidates here in the Zoom. And at the same time, the lecture is live streamed on Bilibili, YouTube, and Crystal Voxel Metaverse. So welcome to join us in this special PhD consortium. So I would like to firstly address this lecture series into the whole event. Actually, we start from June the 13th, and the PhD consortium organized by Tongji University will last around 11 days. So every day we host two lectures, invited two special guests. Today, it's a great honor to us to invite Antonin Picon from Harvard GSD to give us a lecture I will introduce later. And after this sequence, we will have a CDRF conference next weekend, June the 25th, which is also the opening ceremony for the workshops. The workshop will lasting around 9 days and followed by the ceremony, closing ceremony on the awards, and also the awards winner will make lectures on July the 3rd. So welcome, join us on the whole event of this summer. And we can see the participants. This year, we organized more than 130 workshops from 48 countries right now. We have the tutors from 140 institutions. And most important this year, actually, we have the coordinators from different linguistic channel, including English, Chinese, Spanish, Portuguese, Arabic, Japanese, Korean, so on and so forth. So it's great learning platform and sharing platform for the young generation. Actually, we're learning different software, hardwares, and also including different theoretical debate courses. I think this is a platform for learning the new technology-based knowledge. And also we want to contribute to the whole world on this platform. So as to the PhD consortium, we have 3 courses this year based on different topics: architecture philosophy, architecture theory, and also performance-based design. So Antonin Picon was in the second sequence. So this morning, we also have Shiqiao Li, who is from UVA. He already made 3 lectures, and especially make a very interesting discussion on the linguistic philosophical theory, and also make comparison between the Indo-European language and the Semitic language, and showing the divergence and the architecture design thinking based on these 2 linguistic systems. So it's really interesting. So tonight we are looking forward to invite Antoine to make another lecture. At the same time, we also make promotion. We just start a new journal named Architecture Intelligence, which is a peer-reviewed journal for the original research papers, focusing on 3 future scenarios of smart habitat, virtual habitat, and space habitat. And at the same time, we also focus on the emerging digital technology in the whole life cycle of architecture, including design, simulation, optimization, construction, operation, and inhabitation. So the inaugural issue will launch on June the 26th. And we have right now around 15 papers, and looking forward to have more participate from the PhD candidates in the future. And today, the special guest, Antoine Picon, all of us know his name. He is actually the iconic figure in the architecture discipline. And his background, actually, he was trained as an engineer architect and historian. He is a professor of history of architecture and technology at Harvard GSD. He is also the chairman of the foundation of Le Corbusier. He has published extensively on the relations between the technology change, society, architecture, and the city. Among his books, The Digital Culture in Architecture, an Introduction for the Design Professions, which was published in 2010, Augmentation, the Politics of Architecture and Subjectivity in 2013, Smart Cities, a Specialized Intelligence in 2015, and the Materiality of Architecture, which published very soon, last year, 2021. I just read that book, which is extremely interesting and actually give us a lot of guidance for our research and the materiality, which we insist the most important character in the age of the digital futures. So today, Antoine Picon will give us the topic, digital tools for sustainable design and agent transition. So he would like to argue in the past decades, digital tools in architecture and urban have developed with a relative indifference to the environmental change, despite its urgency, whereas digital avant-gardes reveled in innovative geometry and the perspectives opened by computer-driven fabrication. The smart city movement was mostly concerned with the streamlining and extend infrastructure. The indifference is no longer acceptable, but there is a price to pay for it. Beginning with the need of profoundly redefine the principles, scope, and goals of architecture and urban planning, the lecture will discuss what the redefinition entails, beginning with the new relations between the natural and artificial that is entails. So we would like to give the screen to Antoine. So looking forward to the lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Philip, for this generous introduction. I'm very happy to be here with you. And let me share my screen and hopefully, so just a second, starting the PowerPoints. And the ritual question, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Good. So this is a new lecture, so please be patient because not everything is completely definitive. These are current thoughts that I've tried to summarize in this lecture. So the first thing to note is that the digital in architecture has been with us for almost 30 years. Indeed, Columbia University Paperless Studio, which marked its spectacular arrival on the forefront of architectural investigation, goes back to the early 1990s. So despite the rhetoric of its most enthusiastic proponents, the digital belongs partly to history. So far from my intention to say that this history is closed, of course, there is a lot of potential new and exciting development between digital fabrication and artificial intelligence. But this historical dimension has become inescapable, hence the growing use of the term post-digital to characterize our current state of affairs. So in the past 30 years, we've seen a series of evolution. At the beginning, digital architecture, discourse, and experiment were very much on question regarding the production of forms that often possessed a geometry that escaped traditional codes. And this was the time, for example, of Greg Lynn animated form reflection. From the mid-2000s onwards, digital fabrication gained a greater momentum an evolution epitomized by Gramazio and Kohler experiments. The past years have seen as for them the rise of interrogation regarding the potential for disruption of artificial intelligence, and here a picture from Emmanuel Coe's dissertation at Epfl Lausanne on artificial intelligence in architecture. If we move now to the urban, the story is somewhat different, though it starts approximately at the same time, the early 1990s, with speculation regarding the possibility to extend cities using the resources of the rapidly developing World Wide Web. So the theme at the time was how to pass from city of bricks to city of bits, a program well illustrated by books such as Bill Mitchell's City of Bits, or experiments like Amsterdam Digital City. During the next decade, the 2000, the smart city movement began to emerge. Initially fostered by giant digital company like IBM or Cisco, it became rapidly a major subject of concern for municipalities, developers, civic hackers at the beginning of the 2010. So now the past years have been marked by a double and somewhat contradictory evolution. On the one hand, smart technologies and platforms have become quite general. Control rooms like this one have multiplied, and the smart city movement is definitely no longer confined to a few experimental cities in the world. Pretty much every city has a smart city initiative and strategy. On the other hand, there are far less excitation than a few years ago about what smart technologies can achieve. One has begun to realize that they cannot solve all the issues faced by city. So looking at this history and looking at the digital, both at the architectural and the urban level, there are two problems that begin to be immediately evident. The first is the disconnection between architecture and the urban. There are actually relatively few relations between digital architecture and the smart city movement. And contrary to previous moments in the history of architecture and the urban, in which you had a connection, thinks of modernism, modernist architecture is inseparable from its conception of the city, etc. There are very few relations actually between the digital in architecture and the digital in the urban realm. Which is one of the reasons I decided a few years ago to write a book on smart cities from the perspective of the design. So that's a first question. What about the relation between architecture and cities, building and cities? Second problem, which will mainly occupy me today, is the tenuous connection of both digital architecture and reflection and experiments on digital city, their tenuous connection to the environmental challenge that has become very clearly in the past years the main subject of concern regarding the built environment. Despite claims to the contrary, digital neo-avant-garde have been strangely oblivious to the issues of thermal exchanges, gray energy, rising waters, etc. And this includes, by the way, present-day advocates of artificial intelligence. In School of Architecture, this is pretty easy to measure. Proponents of algorithmic manipulation and supporters of a resilient and frugal architecture do have usually very limited interaction. The situation is actually in complete contrast with the beginning of what we know, with the kind of keen interest both for computer and environmental issues that characterize forerunner of digital culture like Buckminster Fuller, a concern epitomized, for example, by projects inspired by his work like the St. Louis Climatron. So relatively little relation. Though at the beginning, for example, the smart city movement seemed open to the environmental challenge, and one of the ideas was that actually digital cities would be also greener cities. And there were experiments, for example, Carlo Ratti, famous experiment about tracking, the recycling of, the content of a trash can in Seattle, where very typical of this interest, this ambition to articulate the digital with the environmental. But it has not worked a lot in practice. It is worth, by the way, remembering that actually the digital has created daunting environmental problems which are far from being solved at this stage. It is well known that the cloud uses today more energy than the civil aviation at the scale of the planet. So there again, this is all the more surprising than in the urban also, the forerunners of the present-day digital city debates and experiments were also interested in the environment. Of course, when I say they have a limited connection, doesn't mean there is no connection at all. A lot of design software have modules today that enable to deal with embodied energy issues. If we look on the other side, for example, computer fluid dynamics, which is an important aspect of environmental research, is of course based on computer modeling and can provide a platform to intersect, digital and environmental concern. Similarly, smart cities usually include an environmental dimension. This is pretty clear, and the digital is often used to manage natural resources in cities. For example, in Singapore, they've modeled pretty much every major tree using finite elements software in order to predict the behavior of the vegetation. But my main argument today is to say that we need to go further. We need to go beyond these relatively limited attempts. And for that, we actually need nothing less than a change in paradigm regarding both buildings and cities, a change of attitude. So it goes beyond tools. I took tools as the title, but I think it's more a kind of philosophy that has to change. I would like also to argue that this change has actually already begun without very often us clearly realizing the true scope of the change. For the digital and the environmental share a number of common assumptions, even if they're not always aware of it. Thus, the shift of paradigm I'm calling for is not only necessary, it has already begun. So this is a little bit what I'd like to unpack now. What does it mean to change paradigm in architecture and the urban to relate more closely, more evidently, the digital to the environmental? So let me begin by architecture. This is where probably the change of paradigm is probably the most important. So despite the capacity of the computer to go beyond objects, the discipline of architecture has remained completely obsessed with the production of objects, with very often spectacular form, with a kind of denial that built objects most of the time disappear sooner or later. In other words, buildings are born, but they eventually die. So we need to understand truly buildings as a temporary phase in a series of processes that extend far beyond their construction and after their destruction. So it's a major change. Of course, a lot of people say that, but actually in School of Design, we're still training people as if they were building pyramids forever. We don't build forever. Building is only part of much more extended cycles in which design has to insert itself. It's very striking, by the way, that digital architecture has been most of the time mobilized to produce monumental things, to produce monumental things that do not take their possible and their eventual death seriously. Even renation is not often taken seriously as a possibility today. And this is related to a theme I've studied again and again, which is the kind of enduring crisis of tectonics. Tectonics, as we knew it for example, columns and lintels, like here on this late 18th century ruin picture, related built object to their possible relation. It introduced strongly this idea that buildings are born, but they also disappear sooner or later. So once again, this is synonymous with a refusal to consider aging and death. Digital objects seem frozen in a kind of perfection that does not allow for their bones to appear. They very often evoke spaceships that have landed in city and that are supposed to be eternally new. Another thing to note is that the digital has also reinforced the contrary tendency to completely dissociate architecture from the processes of constitution of the urban. So much attention has been given to extraordinary forms that the digital has failed very often to inscribe itself in the ordinary processes of constitution of the urban. In some ways, digital architecture is very good at producing spectacular objects, again, like spaceship, which do not connect evidently to their immediate surroundings. A good example, to take another example of my home city of Lyon, is the Confluence Museum, which literally is a kind of spaceship with very little relation to its surrounding. So one of the questions for today might be probably to rediscover types and typological elaboration. As for now, the only clear type in the digital is the server farm big box, which is very clearly anti-urban. So there is a kind of obsession for objects disconnected from their immediate context, an obsession which is all the more surprising that the digital tend to blur simultaneously the sharp contour of objects, a notion on which I will come back in a moment. In addition, the computer is an extraordinary machine to perceive and manipulate not objects, but flows. This is what fascinated Greg Lynn and other early explorers of its potential at the beginning in the first years of digital architecture, and hence the frequent reference of people like Greg Lynn to the work of Muybridge and Marais, as if the true function of the computer was to capture movement. So what does it tell us? That the question has to do with space and time and the need to rethink the relation of architecture to it. We have finally, after so many years to understand something that was probably more evident in the Asian building tradition than in the Western one, that architectural order is fundamentally transient. It does not mean that we should aim systematically at lightness or nomadic installation, but one has to accept this transient character and integrate it into the architectural thinking, which is far from being the case today. As for space, urban space in particular, one has to rethink in terms of possible rules. How does architecture, what kind of rules can we invent so that architecture and the city are in true dialogue again? So something that has remained pretty unclear. So in this lecture, I'm going to move constantly from the architectural to the urban. So a word now on what a change of paradigm in the urban might look like. And this is what I'm calling breaking with the ideal city. So for the urban, the question is a bit different. The main problem doesn't lie in the recognition that processes matter, that we should think in terms of processes rather than objects. Actually, one of the tenets behind the smart city movement is that the city, more than an object, is a series of processes. In that respect, the smart city is the direct inheritor. This is something I've tried to show in my various publications on the question, is the direct inheritor of the cities of flows and networks that had marked the rise of the industrial metropolis. In the 19th century, people discovered gradually that the flows, the metabolism, if you like, of the city was at least as important, if not more, than its physical layout. And this is, for example, the flows of goods entering and exiting Paris in the 19th century. So this idea, in some ways, the smart city is going in the same direction. With, however, an important evolution, which is the passages from global aggregated processes and flows to a kind of more molecular, much more detailed apprehension of what constitutes these flows. And this is well expressed by this series of pictures by my friend Carlo Ratti from the Sensible Lab. Traditionally, we were able to understand what was at the top, that's to say global flows in the city. Today, thanks to things like geolocation, etc., we can pinpoint what is moving exactly, where, etc. We are able to go at the level of the molecule or the atom, if you like, in movement in the city. And this is based, again, on geolocation, with, in some ways, the city, the concrete city, digitally managed, becomes synonymous with an endless series of micro events, like the "you are here," you can see on the screen, or this car is in this position, etc. And the city appears, as you know, something that is structured by all these micro events. Now, the main problem for the urban, for rethinking the urban, is not to move from object to processes. It's rather to stop dreaming of the city from the perspective of a kind of ideal organization. In some ways, this dream of the ideal city has haunted urban reflection since the Renaissance at least, and this is a picture from the Renaissance. So today, translate not necessarily in the terms of the architectural harmony of between monuments and public space, like this picture from the Renaissance, but the idea that the good city is a city in which ideally nothing unexpected would happen. Everything should be predictable. This was the dream of the cybernetic-oriented city, and this is a dream that can still be traced behind many discourses and experiments on the digital or the smart city today. In some ways, the dream of the perfect control room that will make everything predictable and will make the unexpected something completely marginal. So a tendency that is further reinforced by the perspective of a new science of cities. And let's not forget that the past years, because we have big data, etc., have seen a rise in the belief that eventually we will be able to compute cities, to model cities more and more accurately, and to predict their behavior. I think whereas, for architecture, the real paradigm change is to accept that objects may no longer be the center of the discipline, but rather processes. For the city, we have to recognize that this kind of immobile perfection, even if it's a perfection of a series of flows, but let's say this kind of uneventful, totally predictable city is not possible. We have to recognize instead that things happen far beyond the "you are here" or the geolocation of vehicles or the state of the electric grid, etc. Things happen that are very often unpredictable. No system functions with absolute precision. In addition, climate change will add to the incertitude, beginning with what happens to digital infrastructure during episodes of intense heat. Truth is, nobody knows. So the city is not completely computable and may very well remain not computable. And this is where we should also remember that the city is political, that the city is as political as it is material. So the ideal city is a city of paper. It's not, or a city on the screen, but it's not the real city. So we have to abandon, really get rid of this ideal vision of the city, and passing from urban planning to urban design, and related to that, one has probably to abandon the privilege given to urban composition. In some ways, we should stop dreaming that at best, the city should be like this very famous square in Paris, something composed like a work of art. It will never be applicable to the country's sprawling city. Perhaps we should use digital tools rather to multiply micro intervention, as advocated recently by MIT professor Nicolas de Monchaux in his book Local Code, in which he suggests that we should use urban data, to multiply micro intervention in the city, cloud-like intervention, the effect of which cannot be as predictable as the insertion of a traditional type of building in a classic urban fabric. But so once again, we have to abandon predictability. In some ways, urban composition was linked to the dream of making the city beautiful like a well-oiled machine. This is not going to happen, which is something also more general that we have to understand, that our environment will never become ideal again. To take another example, let's take nature. Very often, ecological thought today dream of restoring nature as it was. Truth is, just like cities, we will probably never be able to recreate nature as it once was. We have to accept that it will remain flawed forever by the mistakes we've made. I found always very interesting the Freshkills parks near New York, urban park, an urban park on the top of such a huge garbage dump that actually the ground is still constantly creating gases, etc. And on the right, you can see vents to evacuate the gases. So we are not in a pristine nature. We're in something in which pollution is in check, but some of its effects are never going to disappear. So the city of the future will give more place to nature, but it will probably not be the pristine nature of the past. It's just to finish on this section, the situation of imperfection is well conveyed for me by the French artist Pierre Huyghe and his very disturbing images on the relation between the human and the natural. We may have actually to completely abandon the distinction of all between the natural and the artificial and accept that we are now going to live, and for a very long time, in a series of hybrids between the natural and artificial, which are irremediably flawed. So let me move now to what is actually beginning to ensure the convergence between the digital and the environmental. Because my argument is to say that we should become more aware of what it means, how we should change our conception of architecture, but also the urban. But actually the convergence has already begun. It has already begun without us always realizing how connected are these two approaches. So I think both the digital in architecture and the urban and environmental question also envisaged from architectural and urban perspective share a series of assumptions about the fact that we live in a world, in a material world, which is slightly different from what we believed from the world in which we used to live. So regarding the digital, first, let me just note a few points. Some of them I have actually tried to develop in a number of my publications. The first is that we live in a world in which traditional notion and scales are no longer that clear. And this is one of the reasons that has made the notion of structure that we inherited from the 19th century no longer that evident. Information reigns at every level, and its kind of pervasive rule makes traditional distinction of scale between the non-structural and the structural, for example, no longer relevant. Something captured by fractal geometry, and which is one of the reasons fractal geometry was so often invoked at the beginning of the digital revolution in architecture to try to make sense of what was happening. Speaking of structure, structure is no longer clear. Materials have become very different from what we used to consider as material. Materials used to be something with a lower degree of complexity than structure. Today, they can be all the more complex, that they can be designed at every scale, from the nano to the usual scale we function. Other things are contributing to redefine our relation to the world. For example, traditional opposition between, for example, the concrete and the abstract, the natural and the computational, do not function as before. When I said in the short summary of the lecture that we need to redefine the relation between the natural and the artificial, it's pretty clear today that, it goes with the blurring of the distinction between the concrete and the abstract, or the natural and the computational. And notions such as material computation, popularized by designers like Achim Menges, are very typical of this blurring of traditional polarities or hierarchies. So we live in a very different physical world, a world that is deprived of, that does not function using according to the traditional distinction between structure and material, in which scales have become very often complex and intertwined, a world in which, to compute and to materialize are very often the same thing. A world also populated with phenomena that we did not consider as important a few decades ago. For example, emergence, the idea that from some apparently chaotic system, phenomena of order can arise, is something that we've become aware relatively recently. So a different material world is clearly, I've argued again and again, that probably the digital revolution in architecture is to be thought from the perspective of this different material world. Now the environment forces us also to read our surrounding, to read the physical world differently. There again, with phenomena that used to play a relatively marginal role in discipline like architecture, that have acquired all of a sudden a tremendous influence. Let's take, for example, temperature, humidity gradient. Architects like Philippe Ram, this is one of his projects, have argued, and I think with a lot of weight in their argument, that actually they are becoming central to the discipline of architecture, more central than traditional structural, than load-bearing notion, etc., that architecture used to focus on. Another architect, Iñaki Abalos, has tried to summarize this transition by saying that actually one was passing from classic mechanics to thermodynamics. In some ways, it's the very notion of the material world and what matters in it that is changing. And if we take materials, for example, what we call material today is also different because of notions such as embodied energy, reuse, etc. And there again, they imply a new relation between the natural and the artificial. What is a biosource material? What is it artificial? To what extent is it natural? So the world, the physical world, has begun to change. The physical world, we don't understand it in the same way under the double influence of the digital and the environmental. Doesn't mean that this transformation is univocal. It is actually permeated with contradiction. Regarding the digital, for example, we are in the middle of an inescapable paradox. On the one hand, the digital is contrary with the idea that, the physical world is fundamentally continuous, but actually digital tools are discontinuous by essence. To digitalize is actually to transform continuous variation into a discrete description. So in some ways, this world is full of paradox. Another paradox is the kind of tension between a world in which everything is theoretically computable, but a world that is very often unpredictable. So in the case of the environmental, the increased concern for materials is coupled also with paradoxical effects, such as, for example, the multiplication of composite materials, which are actually hard to recycle. What is very striking is that we have a lot of recipes that are given in manuals, in textbooks, in classes about how to disassemble architecture, for example. You know, that's how ideally we should design for, you know, in an environmentally challenged planet. In reality, we're very far from it. We've never used, for example, so much glue than today. But I think that despite these contradictions, a possible way to make sense of what is happening under our eyes is to consider that the physical world, to which architecture, but also the urban refer themselves, has become very different from the one which former generation of designers used to refer themselves to. And there are once again striking relation between the world evoked by the digital designers and the world that environmental designers are evoking. In short, we have only one planet, this planet on which Bruno Latour incites us to land, down to earth, to land for good. There is not a planet for digital designer and another planet for environmental designers. We need actually to realize this is the same planet, and we have to make sense of it using at the intersection of digital tools and sustainable questions. Now, what is changing also is our experience of the world. When I say the physical world is changing, doesn't mean it's rather the way we understand it, the way we relate to it, that is changing. In other words, it's almost a sensory evolution, the way we touch, see, hear, taste. And it's almost impossible to separate this evolution from the evolution of subjectivity. And as we all know, the digital is inseparable from all sorts of speculation regarding the evolution of the human. And for example, there's been an abundant literature on the connection between the digital and the theme of the cyborg. It's worth remembering, by the way, that cyborg meant cybernetically augmented. So the idea that the technology was inseparable from a shift in the way we understand ourselves. The way we understand ourselves has hybrids between the natural, between flesh and technology. This is not the only possibility opened by the digital to understand differently subjectivity. Another one has been the idea of distributed subjectivity. In a network, I'm actually only a point of view on the network, but actually it's as if part of who I am was distributed along the various lines that constitute the network. On the left, it's Facebook network of relation. And in some ways, we have to imagine, or as subject in this hybrid world, which is both physical and digital today, we constantly pulsate between spreading ourselves into all the channels that are open for communication and regrouping sometimes to assert our own individuality, which is why the age of digital distribution and almost dispersion is also the age in which we try to reassemble ourselves, tattoos being one of the symbols of that. So one of the consequences, by the way, of this kind of thing is a kind of radical questioning of the distinction between subject and object. I think one of the biggest paradoxes of the digital age in architecture is to be so obsessed by object, while at the same time questioning whether we can still speak of objects, since after all, there seems to be a kind of affective continuum between subject and object. And ornament and concrete ornamental and patterning practices are typical of these kind of possible abolition of the distance between subject and object. For example, this tactile wall of Herzog and de Meuron tend to suggest that actually, since between seeing and touching, there seems to be a blurring, that actually it's not really, there is no empty space separating the viewer from the skin of the building. So these foray into different or mutating forms of subjectivities are often described as post-human. And, it's quite common to say that the digital is actually linked to the rise of post-human subjectivities. But I would argue that, are we really post-human, or aren't we simply in a new phase of this constant reinvention of what we call the human? In other words, the digital forces us to consider that to be human today is a very different question than in the past, for example, in the modernist age. It means, for example, that we're not that easy to separate from our surroundings, that we are not this isolated figure in the middle of a void space. So now if we move to the environmental discourses and experiments, of course, technological augmentation is less present, but the kind of inseparability between the human and what surrounds it is there again very important. So it translates in the environmental sphere by the idea that humans and non-humans cannot be separated and distinguished that easily, and that we should actually design for both. Here is, for example, a poster for a manifesto for the solidarity of non-human and humans in urban space, a manifesto that was published online by Epfl. So we have, in some ways, we live in a world in which this changing material world is a world that forces us to rethink who we are as humans, to be aware of that the boundaries between us and what's around us, between us and the machine, but also between us and the animal, are extremely porous. And again, here a picture by Pierre Huyghe to convey this kind of ambiguity. The big question today might very well be, what does it mean to be human? And in relation to what surrounds us, technology, built objects, but also, non-human actors of all sorts. So what is important to note for me, and this goes back to a theme I've explored again and again, is the intimate relationship between our experience and understanding of the physical world and the way we understand ourselves and our relation to others. So in my latest book, I've chosen to call materiality the relation that humans have at a given moment in history in a given society with the physical world. And one of the ideas was to say that though we tend to believe that materiality is an entirely objective thing, actually our understanding of the physical world varies in direct relation to our understanding of who we are as humans. And the picture before was of that to show that artificial intelligence, one of the central questions of artificial intelligence may very well be that. What does artificial intelligence tell us about what is the world that surrounds us, but also who are we? So envisaged from this perspective, materiality again is inseparable from the way we understand ourselves through the lens of the relation with our physical environment. And with the idea that architecture does play an important role in this kind of co-production, if you like, of the material, of the understanding of the material world and the understanding of the human. And for me, to inhabit is actually to define partially oneself through an intimate relation with objects made of earth, brick, stone, steel, or concrete that reveals something about our bodies and mind. In other words, architecture is about inhabiting in the full sense of the term, and from the practicality of sheltering to the impression and feelings that contribute to structure the mental sphere. This is Louis Kahn's famous Exeter library. So to summarize, I would say that one of the most urgent tasks today is to try to understand what does it mean to inhabit both as contemporary of the digital and as, contemporary of the most severe environmental crisis we've ever seen. Again, we have only one world to inhabit, and we need to go back and forth between, the two main categories through which we're prehended today, the digital revolution and the environmental crisis. I think it's more than time, again, to think about their relation. And what I'm suggesting is that we have for that to understand how both actually completely reshape our understanding of the physical world. And by the same token, unavoidably reshape also our understanding of ourselves. So this is, for me, my main point. And I would really like to insist on that. We cannot go on, especially in architectural education, having those silos, as if, you had some people dreaming also only of algorithm and others of biosource material. We have now to move toward their convergence, because once again, we have only one planet. We do not have two planets. So let me try to move for the conclusion of this lecture. I've tried to remain within reasonable limits of time so that we have a little bit of time for the discussion. Let me try to move to a series of further consequences, what I've called from objects and processes to events and action. It may appear at first a bit more abstract, but I hope after all that I've said that it will make sense for you. The first thing I wanted to note is that if among the things that circulate from the world, the new physical world evoked by the digital, and the world of the environmental crisis, is the idea that reality is not only about objects. We have to move from object to processes, but we have to go even further and to understand that actually we are living in a world that is structured actually by events, from the micro occurrences of what happens here and there to more global things that happen. Think of all the weather disruption, etc. But the digital is also full of surprise. So, and we have to understand that this world of events is actually our world and forces us to understand differently who we are. So from that, I'd like to propose the following also, that architecture has to move from object to processes, but it has also to understand that it is actually, by the end, what it produces are events. Architecture creates events, or to be more specific, creates very specific things which constitute stage on which events can happen. And as if architecture's mission, and this goes back actually a long way in history, but I think it's now time to fully integrate it, that the mission of architecture is actually to create the stage on which things happen. So we have to understand two things which are a bit complex. The first is that architecture itself is a form of action. Design, it's not a classic production. It's not about only shaping objects. It's an action in the world. And second, this action is actually the preliminary to other action that will unfold in the setting defined by architecture. So the same applies to the city. There again, from processes to events and to action. The city, this is something the situationist had the intuition of. A city is not an ideal organization. It is actually a platform for things to happen. And this is the psychogeography map, one of the famous psychogeographical maps of the situationist, but in which, in a way, a city is to be understood as a potential. for things to unfold, which are not necessarily predictable. They should be actually to a large extent unpredictable, but what is predictable is that the city is the stage for these actions to unfold. So we have to understand in some ways that design, both at the architectural but also urban scale, is about action. And it goes further than a production. It is also something, but by the same token, let's be clear, it's not about dematerializing architecture, transforming architecture into some vague political discourse. Architecture, urban planning and urban design are deeply physical. And we should be reminded that this action takes place in the physical space. Which leads me to another question, which is embodiment. That's to say, it is because architecture, I say that, architecture, cities, etc., are like stages for action, but they're physical entities. And it's actually this physical character, this kind of embodied character that creates the possibility of meaning, of the symbolic, etc. So to conclude, for me, more and more, what strikes me is that one of the questions of AI, central question of AI, would be how can it participate to this question of the embodiment? How can it participate to the true perception of what a finite world entails today? I think in some ways, one of the reasons architecture and the urban dimension are so important is because they are really linked to this finitude of the planet. This is because the planet is finite that they matter so much. And once again, I think we may have to rethink AI, not in terms of all the sophisticated combination it can make, but how AI can participate to this profound embodiment of architecture and the urban. And I will stop there, stop sharing my screen. And wow.
Great. Fantastic. I think it's a remarkable lecture, especially give a note to the topic of digital future this year, One Planet. Thanks for that. Thank you so much. I think we need to thinking a lot of the words you just mentioned, which is really a kind of enlightenment to the architecture intelligence we just launched right now. I think a lot of profound thinking. Especially as a conclusion, we're starting from your conclusion. I think that is remarkable. You're talking about the AI, especially should engage or participate the embodiment of the city and architecture. So that is a very interesting point, this kind of embodiment, or we name augmentation, AI augmentation to architecture and fabrication. That is for sure is based on the process in the architecture discipline. But I think I want to ask this kind of embodiment, the difference between the embodiment and the augmentation from AI, which can really means gave the meaning to the analogical of what is the architecture intelligence. So we make a lot of discussion last year on the difference of artificial intelligence and architecture intelligence. I think maybe from this question, this kind of embodiment is the human-centric actually. But when AI augmented the human, what is the subjective, the new subjective of future? Is that still human-centric, or is that new centric, which based on the human and the machine integration? So how do you thinking on that? How AI can really empower or to the architecture discipline? So do you have any further analysis on the relationship between AI and architecture?
A couple of things. I have no doubt that in a generation from now, we'll have artificial intelligence who may be able to design relatively virtuously, in a virtuoso manner, all kinds of things. But I do think that embodiment means actually what is relevant for humans and for animals, etc. I think AI so far is not a distributed form of intelligence like ours. That's to say, we have a form of intelligence. Of course, most of our neurons are in the brain, but actually we inhabit bodies. And that creates a very specific relation to the built environment. So I do think one of the challenges will be actually to teach AI in order to be able to have a fruitful conversation with it, to actually understand better a condition which is very, very foreign to it, which is not to be a computing machine, but to be actually something more distributed in bodies, etc. So I think that's a first thing. A second thing for me is that it is clear that design is going more and more to be not only about humans, but about the cohabitation of humans and non-humans. And we need also in some ways to teach AI what it means to inhabit. And I think, animals inhabit clearly because they have a body, etc. Take cats. It's evident they inhabit apartments or houses or gardens or whatever. So which is, some ways to define oneself in relation to a territory, a space, etc. I think AI is profoundly non-localized. So we have probably to try, to initiate a conversation with it once it's sophisticated enough to see how we can organize a true cohabitation with AI.
Great. And at the same time, which goes to your new book, we read it carefully. You're talking about the materiality of architecture, which is extremely important still to the discipline, the physical and the material process, which meaning a lot. While on the other hand, AI actually is an immaterial intelligence, which is maybe abstract and globally influence a lot of disciplines. So how do you think this kind of material intelligence in architecture still will introduce the AI as a kind of tools, or as you mentioned, as a kind of augmented to the materiality or material process of the discipline? How would you like to address this kind of material and immaterial intelligence relationship between AI and the physical materiality of the architecture in your book? Could you analyze a little bit further, still kind of relation of this kind of AI is kind of black box predictive process, which is not from the human brain, but actually it's a kind of intelligence. It's kind of augmented to the human construction or human making process. So how would you like to define the materiality, the future new materiality in architecture?
Well, we have to go. I think we have to work. This is, this is something I'm currently thinking of. I'm preparing a new book on digital culture, which will try to address some of these issues, but I'm still in reflection. I think we need to go beyond augmentation. Augmented means usually that you correlate atoms with bits, but you don't truly. I think what is interesting in inhabiting, it goes beyond augmentation. It's no longer a logic, which is a kind of prosthesis, if you like. We have to go beyond that. And to really, I think one of the questions which is, one of the questions for me will be actually to teach finitude to AI. which I think it looks like a stupid question, but you know, the fact that we have bodies makes us integrate the question of finitude. I think if we really want to live with AI in the future, we'll have to teach AI some sense of finitude. And this is what I call embodiment. Because in some ways, you know, architecture functions because of finitude, because architecture is actually something that, you know, encloses. So it's about our finitude. So I think AI can mimic architecture, but to really live architecture, it must have some sense of the finitude.
Great, interesting. So I think definitely at this point, I would like to.
There is a question in the chat. I saw that.
Please, from Gloria Benedem. Thank you very much for the great lecture. I have a question. Do you think starting to live inside the virtual environment and transferring most of the architectural design space into simulation instead of real environments would be beneficial for the one planet and more harmful for it? Good question.
Good question. I would say a little bit of both. I think, first of all, we cannot transfer everything in virtual spaces. You know, think of when you take an airplane, you know, even if you're in coach and not in business class, if you want to sleep, you know, even if you have a virtual reality helmet or something, you know, you won't have more space for your legs. So it means that, you know, we can inhabit virtual spaces up to a certain point. I do think it could have beneficial things, you know, for example, you know, we can learn, we can do a number of things without having to spend, you know, gas to go somewhere, etc. So Zoom, for example, is not always a good thing, but it can be a good thing. It enables us to be together despite all the crisis in the world. So it has beneficial aspect, but I think we cannot transfer the whole world into digital environment. Let's not forget again what I say, the cloud burns more energy than airplanes these days. So we have to understand that actually there is the need of a certain frugality. I didn't mention that, but we will have to enter a world in which digital resources have to be used with a certain form of frugality. We're not yet there, but we have to imagine that. So if we were to live completely inside virtual environment, wouldn't be good for the planet by the end.
Good. Any further question? Chao, do you have any question you would like to put forward? Okay, we have another one.
Hello, thank you so much for the lecture. I would like to ask, why should we teach AI finitude and not learn for it the infinitude? It depends what you call finitude. It depends the definition of finitude. I was mentioning finitude. Well, I still think we're finite beings. You know, we're born and we die. Why learn infinity? Well, truth is we're not immortal so far. So, and I think part of what makes life meaningful is because we're mortal. So meaning is linked to finitude, not to infinity. Infinity is a kind of escape, and usually we don't know what it means, really, except in math. So I would, you know, science fiction, etc., and, you know, vampire books are full of immortal beings who lose gradually the sense that things matter. So strangely, I believe that finitude is a condition to make sense of things. It doesn't mean that the cyclical nature of the planet, yes, but cyclical nature went with finitude. You know, peasants have a very clear notion that things are limited. So it's not because they repeat themselves that, you know, they are limited even in the number of cycles they can observe. So that would be my answer. And because AI doesn't know limits so far.
Thank you. Thanks for your question.
Hello, Antoine.
Hello.
Thank you for the lecture, and I do have a question. Well, I think the lecture is really fantastic, and I found most striking is the end arguments you make, like the proposition saying we should move from the object and processes to event and actions. I feel the logic behind this argument is to argue the uncomputable and unpredictable, and also I saw Gitbo's naked city was also brought up to the table. I feel very empathic to this argument, but I also have some doubt myself regarding to what this transition to event and actions may lead us in the future. How it could be different from the Gitbo Bernard-Tschumi lineage offered in the 60s and 70s. So that's kind of my question.
It's a very good question. And to be honest, this is something I'm working on. I'm not sure myself to have completely mastered what I mean is that, you know, I'm not advocating that we should stop producing objects. You know, this is not the point, but we should begin to understand that objects are not the ultimate point. You see what I mean? That design is actually within a series of processes and itself is about creating situation that may, so design is a form of action. But of course, designers, concretely, I'm not advocating for designers to become politicians. I'm advocating for designers. Neither I'm completely convinced by the situationist, because the situationist, by the end, you could not design anything. Because because everything that was designed was inherently bad. That was why Constant was never able to finish with his New Babylon. So I think we have to accept that architecture, by the end, simplifies the array of possible. A little bit, you know, my favorite metaphor is the stage of the theater, and which is what you know, architecture functions as if you design a theater, which is a form of action, which is not the political action. The political action is to go on the stage and make a discourse. The architect designed the stage, and with a certain vision of what a debate, what kind of play should be on the stage, but it does not write the play. You see what I mean? And you can actually design very different theater for very different purposes. And that's the way architects do politics. But the materiality of the theater, the fact that you have a stage that is higher usually than the seats of the spectators, etc., participate, it is also something. So that's a little bit what I have in mind. And in a way, you know, we will still, I'm very attached to the materiality, evidently, of architecture, because I do think that, you know, one thing that characterizes architect, and talking about finitude, you know, we all have fantastic dream of space, but then there is somebody who takes, you know, a pen and begins to draw, and then you realize that not everything is possible. This is also what finitude means, that, you know, not everything is possible. Architecture is not a dream. It's something that it has to exist in the physical world with its limitation. So that would be my answer at that stage. But I agree, it's not completely tightly knit. This is something I'm working still on.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes. Meanwhile, at the same time, I think, Antoine, we would like to invite to publish this lecture in the Architectural Intelligence, if you like. I think it's a really good note to our argument recently on the topic of architecture intelligence and on topic of one planet. I think it's very special and specific to have a very good theoretical analyze, and also it's showing the profound thinking from you to our society. I think so. I would like to send an invitation to you.
Well, as I told you, this summer is a bit tight for me. So, but we'll have to talk about that later.
Not in a hurry.
Okay, if it's not in a hurry, yes, I'll be happy to. I'm always happy to cooperate with you, Philip. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you so much. I think it's great thanks to you to give this very clear but profound thinking. And right now, it's this moment giving to us, especially to our PhD program. I think it's a very good note and the guidance to all the lectures we organized. Thank you so much on that.
Thank you, Philip, for having me, and wish you a great continuation of your work here in Shanghai and all over the world. How many are you in Shanghai right now?
You mean
among the participants?
Participants, we have totally we have 20 workshops, and every workshop will invite like 20 to 25 students. So totally we'll have like hundreds of participants to the workshop.
Magnificent.
Yeah.
Superb.
At the same time, we have different lectures which will happen during the events, and which is live stream. So thousands of people will audit in lectures or in the different talks. So I think it's like an open education platform to introduce our thinking, I think, this community to the whole discipline. Yeah.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Philip, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.
Let's keep in touch.